display the power and the might of God with greater clarity, so that we can all see how awesome our God is, and so that it would be clear for everyone that the Lord is God. We said last Sunday, didn't we, that there's kind of three reasons, three purposes behind the plagues. To release the slaves, for one. God is loosening Pharaoh's grip on the Israelites. Reason number two, to judge Pharaoh for his sin. He's done some pretty awful things to the Israelites, and this is his punishment. And number three, to display the power and the glory of God. And last Sunday we looked at Pharaoh, this weak, lonely, stubborn, lying man. And so then tonight, I want us to see who Pharaoh is up against. It's important for us to recognise that Pharaoh isn't picking a fight with Moses and Aaron, is he? It's not really about Moses and Aaron, they're just the messengers. Pharaoh is not wrestling with the Israelites as a nation. Instead, Pharaoh has picked a fight with none other than the Lord himself. Moses writes these plagues almost as if they're a contest, a back and forth. Pharaoh and the Lord, they are competing for who is the rightful ruler of the Israelites. Pharaoh says, "They're my slaves." But the Lord replies, "No, they're my children." So then tonight, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking through who is this God who sends these 10 plagues. And we've got 5 things to see about this God. He's the only true God. He's the author of creation. He's trustworthy and true. He's the righteous judge. And he is the merciful Lord. Let's see firstly then, he's the only true God. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Paul says that the existence of God is clear for everyone to see. Everyone can see the eternal power and the divine nature just by looking at the world around them, by looking at creation. You only need to look at the brilliant design of a tree to realise that there's a creator. Sap takes all of these nutrients up from the roots into the branches. That's incredible, isn't it? You just look at a tree and it looks like a block of wood. There's so much going on inside it. And in the leaves, they're collecting the sunlight and turning it into energy. That's amazing. You come away from looking at a tree and you think, clearly, there is an intelligent designer behind this incredible universe. I saw this clip of Ronald Reagan. I never thought I'd quote Ronald Reagan in a sermon. But he said he didn't understand atheists at all. He couldn't get atheists. He said, "I want to invite an atheist to a dinner at the White House, and I want to put in front of them this amazing meal, the best meal they've ever eaten, and after dinner, I'm going to ask them, do you believe in the cook?" It's true, isn't it? We look at this incredible world and we say, I don't believe in a creator. And yet, we believe in a cook who makes our meals. Unfortunately, throughout history, that's been the way, isn't it? That people haven't given God the credit for his creation. Either they've denied that he exists, or they've replaced him with gods of their own false gods. And you know, ancient Egypt was no different. And they worshipped a whole bunch of different gods and gave credit to these gods instead of honouring the true God. Do you remember what Pharaoh said to Moses and Aaron when they first came in to see him? Chapter 4, verse 2, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him?" Pharaoh does not recognise the Lord as a God worth worshipping. Instead, he's got his own set of gods. Egypt has Osiris, Set, Isis, Horus, Re, and all kinds of others. So many that you lose count. And they thought they trusted in these gods for their life and their light, for health and fertility, for crops and for cattle. They believed that all of their success came from these gods. There's a historian who says that the way that the Egyptians thought about their gods, they had these stories where these gods would compete against each other. So Osiris would have a fight against Set, and they were trying to compete for who would be the top god. But it was a fairly even contest between all of the Egyptian gods. Osiris was kind of the main one, but it was all quite even between the different gods until the Lord comes along. And none of these Egyptian gods are able to stand up against the Lord. Now, you see, when the Lord arrives on the scene, there is no contest. These plagues are set up not just as a battle between Pharaoh and the Lord, but between Pharaoh, his magicians, his advisors, all of his gods, versus the Lord. 10 times they stage this contest. And 10 times the Lord comes out victorious. You know those cardboard cutouts that you have? We had one, didn't we, for the Queen, for the Jubilee tea. It's as if these Egyptians, they've set up these cardboard cutouts of gods, and they've said, here you go. Here is your God, worship them. And then in these 10 plagues, it's as if the Lord is coming along, and he just gives these gods a nudge. And you know what happens when you nudge a cardboard cutout? Down it goes, flat on its face. They're nothing. They're no gods at all. Why worship the god of the Nile when the Lord comes along and turns it to blood? Why worship the frog fertility god when the Lord comes along and leaves piles of dead frogs stinking out your whole land? Why worship the sun god when the Lord blocks out the light? Why worship the cattle god when the Lord wipes them out with a disease? I could go on. There's things online that you can see where they suggest that there's a different god for each of the 10 plagues. Every time you see a plague, it's the Lord knocking over a cardboard cutout, toppling these fake Egyptian gods, until you're left with just one, the Lord. He is the only true and living God. And there are no other gods. Everything else is just pretending. It's a lump of stone or wood. Exodus 7, verses 3 to 5 says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt. If there is one thing that we learn from these plagues, it's that the Lord is the only true God. And he alone is worthy of our worship. As we try to kind of connect the dots between these things and ourselves, I can't imagine that many of us are worshipping Osiris. But maybe more applicable is the question, is our worship reserved for the Lord alone? Do we give God the credit that he deserves? Do you remember the first commandment? The first commandment, we probably have it memorized as, you shall have no other gods before me. Interestingly, I think the CSB does a very good job of translating it and says, do not have other gods besides me. It's a very subtle difference, isn't it? Before or besides. It's quite significant. It's not just saying, don't put anything else ahead of God in your list of priorities. The commandment is saying, don't even have anything else besides the Lord. There shouldn't be any competing priorities alongside God for your devotion. Because every other god is just a cardboard cutout. There are no other gods. The Lord alone is worthy of our worship and love. And so every responsibility that we have, every commitment in our lives, every authority that we have around us, they are below the Lord in our list of priorities. Because the Lord is the only true God. Let's see, secondly, that the Lord is the author of creation. Rivers, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock, boils, hailstorms, locusts, light, and life. It's quite a list, isn't it? But not only do these 10 plagues represent a complete and utter annihilation of all the Egyptian gods, they also demonstrate to us, don't they, that the Lord's power is over all of creation. In the very beginning, God created the seas and the lakes and the rivers. And so here in Exodus 7, it's no challenge whatsoever, is it, for the Lord to turn the river to blood, because he made the river. At Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, God said, "Let there be light." And so it's not difficult for the Lord in Exodus 10 to say, "Let the light stop." At Genesis 2, verse 7, the Lord breathed life into the lungs of Adam. And so God is perfectly able to withdraw that life in Exodus 12. As you watch the 10 plagues unfold, the thing that becomes abundantly clear is that the Lord has the authority over all of creation. The power and might of God stretches from the sun to the sky to the skin. Everything is under his authority, from land animals to creepy crawlies to amphibians. Creation is the Lord's. And so it is for him to bring the swarms and the storms and the darkness and the death, if he so wishes. I think that is such an important thing for us to remember at this particular time. Because if you turn on your television, I'm sure that you are bombarded by news of climate change warnings. Our planet is dying. We're on the path to extinction. Panic. Well, that's for the Lord to decide. The earth is the Lord's, and so it will end when he says so, not when Greta Thunberg says. Now, please don't misunderstand me. As human beings, the Lord has given us a responsibility to care for this planet, hasn't he? In Genesis, he appointed us as stewards, caretakers of this world. We need to take that responsibility seriously. We need to do that job well. We don't want to trash the planet. But the point that I'm making is that the news reports would like you to believe that our world is spiraling out of control. No, it's not. It's never been spiraling out of control. The Lord who sends the swarms of frogs is still in charge of all the amphibians. The Lord who turned the water to blood is still in charge of the water. The Lord who sent the boils on the Egyptians, he's still in control of global pandemics. The Lord is, not just was, the Lord is the author of creation. Let's think thirdly about how he is trustworthy and true. One of the things that we noticed last Sunday about Pharaoh is that he is a liar. He's not to be trusted. On 4 occasions through these plagues, he says, okay, I give up, you can go. And then as soon as the plague was over, he said, actually, I take it back, you can't go. But contrast that with what we hear the Lord say and what the Lord does. Chapter 7, verse 19, the Lord said, "Stretch your hand over the waters of Egypt, and they will become blood." what happened? The water turned to blood, just like God said. Chapter 8, verse 2, the Lord said, I will plague all your territory with frogs. What happened? He plagued the territory with frogs, just like God said. Chapter 8, verse 16, the Lord said, strike the dust of the land, and it will become gnats. What happened? The dust turned to gnats, just like God said. And on it goes. 10 times. For every single plague, God said, this is what's going to happen, and every single time it happened. Exactly as God said it would. There's no take-backs with God. There's never a point where he says, actually, I didn't mean that. What he says will happen, happens. You know, trustworthiness is a rare commodity nowadays, isn't it? It's probably not just nowadays. It's probably always been rare. But we're surrounded by a lack of trustworthiness. People let us down. They fail to live up to expectations. That they fail to follow through on their promises. And sometimes they just flat out lie to our faces. In a world where trustworthiness is so hard to come by, who can we trust? Well, there's one person who is completely and utterly trustworthy. One person who will never fail us. One person who will never say one thing and then do something else. He will never disappoint us. And he is the Lord, trustworthy and true, the God who never lies. We saw this in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't we, a few months back, that Jesus says, whoever hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. We can build our lives. We can stake everything we've got on the words of Jesus because they are a solid rock, immovable, dependable, faithful. Let's think fourthly about how God is the righteous judge. You know, sometimes I think it's tempting to feel that these 10 plagues are a little bit extreme, a little bit harsh. Have you ever thought that? Pharaoh needs a bit of a slap on the wrist. He's not been very nice. But turning all of his water to blood, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? Sending boils on everyone. The death of the firstborn. God has got a bit out of hand here, hasn't he? Well, I think part of the reason why we think that way is because we're not as pure and holy as God is. We don't see things as clearly as he does. We feel that Pharaoh only needed a tap on the knuckles because we look at our own lives, we see our own sin, and we think, well, no one's perfect, are they? We're a bit more lenient on Pharaoh. We tend to see right and wrong as kind of like a sliding scale of greys. This sin's pretty bad. This one's a bit worse. This one's really bad. But our lines of right and wrong are very blurry. But God sees right and wrong with much greater clarity. With God, he sees good and evil much more in black and white. It is clear-cut. God sees sin as the vile, offensive horror that it really is. I think maybe the other reason why we're tempted to feel Pharaoh's a bit harshly treated here is because we forget what the kings of Egypt have done. Do you remember Exodus 1, verse 22? Pharaoh commanded all his people, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile. The Pharaoh had made the Nile a place of death, a place of bloodshed for the Israelites. And so in this first plague, when we see the Lord turning the Nile to blood, there's a correspondence there, isn't there? one for the other. The Lord is turning this right back on the Egyptians' head. You make the Nile a place of blood for the Israelites? Well, I will make the Nile a place of blood for the Egyptians. Or how about this one from chapter 9, verses 8 and 9? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of furnace soot," and Moses is to throw it toward heaven in the sight of Pharaoh, and it will become fine dust over the entire land of Egypt. It will become festering boils on the people and animals throughout the land of Egypt. Where did they get the furnace soot from? Well, it must have been a fire, a kiln, perhaps. Maybe the sort of kiln that you would use to bake bricks. All of the commentators seem to agree that there's some real irony here. There's some poetic justice. This furnace soot must have come from a fire or a kiln where the Egyptians hardened their bricks, the bricks that the Israelites were making. And so these furnaces, these fires, were a symbol of the oppression and the slavery and the back-breaking work that Pharaoh has put on the Israelites. So then as these ashes are thrown up into the air, becoming boils, it is in direct response to Egypt's horrid treatment of their slaves. Maybe the most obvious example of how the Lord is giving Pharaoh what he deserves is back in chapter 4, verse 22 and 23. This is what the Lord says: "Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go that he may worship me, but you refused to let him go. Look, I am about to kill your firstborn son." A son for a son. That last plague, the death of the firstborn, it was a response to the way that Pharaoh has treated God's son. And so you see that these plagues, they're not God lashing out in an uncontrolled rage. Each plague was an act of judgment that Pharaoh and the Egyptians had brought on themselves. God is perfectly righteous when he judges. God never punishes anyone that didn't fully deserve it. And God never lets anyone get away scot-free. You know, that remains true even today. God never punishes anyone who doesn't deserve it, and he never lets anyone get away scot-free. Now, that's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That it's not just Pharaoh who has to face justice for his actions. Every single person who's ever lived on planet Earth must face the judgment of God. So what's the answer? If we all have to face judgment, do we have any hope? Well, let's see, fifthly, the merciful Lord. As you read through these plagues, it can sometimes feel like a non-stop barrage of suffering. Wave upon wave upon wave of punishment. It feels constant all the way through these chapters. But actually, that's not quite accurate. For instance, take the fourth plague, the flies. Let's just read chapter 8, verse 20 and 21. The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh when you see him going out to the water. Tell him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. But if you will not let my people go, then I will send swarms of flies against you, your officials, your people, and your houses." The Lord is giving Pharaoh a chance, isn't he? He's giving him a warning ahead of time. We do this with our children all the time, don't we? If you do that one more time, I'll take that toy from you. If you don't do what I've asked you to do, there'll be consequences. We give them a chance, and I hope we want them to take that chance. We want them to do the right thing so that they can enjoy their reward or whatever it is. God is giving Pharaoh a warning so that he will listen to these warnings and hopefully do what he's been asked to do. You know, God gives Pharaoh a warning before 7 out of the 10 plagues. Only the gnats, boils, and darkness come without a warning. With all the rest of the plagues, Pharaoh is given a chance. He's given an opportunity to do what God has asked him to do. And actually, while Pharaoh doesn't listen to this warning, Pharaoh is ignoring every chance that God has given him. The rest of the Egyptians actually do listen. They do respond to the warnings. Look at chapter 9, verse 20 and 21. Those among Pharaoh's officials who feared the word of the Lord made their servants and livestock flee to the shelters. But those who didn't take to heart the Lord's words left their servants and livestock in the field. Some of these Egyptians, they learned their lesson, didn't they? They responded to the warnings that God had given them, and they run for cover. God says there's going to be hail, and so they get to the shelters. And so they're safe. But then there's others who just ignore it, and they're stuck out in the hail. And you know, those 2 verses actually perfectly describe humanity today, don't they? There are those who do not fear the word of the Lord. They don't listen. The judgment day, who cares? Don't believe it. And then there's others who fear the word of the Lord. They know that they need to respond, and they run for cover. I wonder which of those people are you tonight? When you hear the Bible warning of a day when you must meet God and face judgment for your life, do you shrug it off? Or do you run for cover? Because as we've seen tonight, God is always true to his word. He said he would send hail, and he sent hail. He said there would be a judgment day, and there will be a judgment day. And at that point, those who shrug off God's warnings, just like they were left out in the hail, well, they will face justice for their actions. Notice, not only does God give warnings to the Egyptians, but listen to what he says in chapter 8, verse 22 and 23. On that day, I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen, where my people are living. No flies will be there. This way you will know that I, the Lord, am in the land when I make a distinction between my people and your people. In judgment, the Lord always makes a distinction between those who are his and those who are not. In the case of the plagues, this meant that God didn't send flies and death of the livestock, or hail, or darkness, or death of the firstborn on the Israelites. But then for us, if we're to be saved from the judgment day, well, then we must belong to God. We read this morning, didn't we? If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. Do you belong to Christ? Have you submitted your life to him? Have you confessed your sin? Because it's only by belonging to Christ that you can escape the judgment. Don't be like Pharaoh. Listen to the warnings. Bow to the Lord while you can. Because even though God is the judge, he is also the Lord who shows mercy. We're going to sing. We're going to sing about the mercy of God before we come to take the Lord's Supper together in a moment. His mercy is more.